words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, our God, our strength, and our Redeemer. Amen. Cain and Abel, David and Saul, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, Notorious B.I.G. and Tupac Shakur, George Bush and Colin Powell. What do all of those pairs of people have in common? Anybody know? They all had conflict with each other. They all got into something with each other. Conflict between human beings has been around since the beginning of time. Cain and Abel were the first sons of the earth. And conflict has been around ever since then. Now I imagine in that list of people that I just mentioned, the conflict may have not been handled too good in a couple of those cases. There's some very common ways that humanity deals with conflict that aren't terribly healthy. The first of which is probably the easiest way to deal with conflict. It's to avoid it. You get into conflict with somebody and you just plain don't deal with it. It's the easiest way to deal with it, but it's not exactly the healthiest way. And a cousin to that avoidance is passive-aggressive behavior. You know, you get into a conflict with somebody and you really don't want to deal with it, but it leads to maybe a little sarcastic comments. Maybe subtle sabotage. You tell somebody you might do something, but then you really don't because of something that happened between the two of you before. There's another unhealthy way that we deal with conflict typically. It's escalation. So you get into a conflict with somebody and the other person escalates the conflict. Maybe there's name calling. Maybe there's screaming and yelling. That's a little bit easier to do, but again, it's not very healthy. And then finally, probably the most insidious form of conflict that we exhibit today in the ways that we deal with it is gossip. Everybody loves to gossip. But it absolutely does nothing to resolve a conflict. Our passage from Matthew today provides a healthy framework, I think, for how to deal with conflict within the Christian community. And this framework that Jesus gives us is rooted in the larger themes that we find in the 18th chapter of this gospel. Those themes are humility, forgiveness, and the nature of the Christian community. Before we dig in too deeply, let's remember where we are in Matthew's gospel. For the last 2 Sundays, we've been working in chapter 16. Jesus and the disciples were in Caesarea Philippi, and Peter answers Jesus' question, "Who do people say that I am?" correctly. Peter says, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And then Jesus describes how hard it's going to be a follower of his. Now, that happened in Caesarea Philippi. Matthew, the next series of passages, we don't know exactly where they take place. Matthew tells us it's 6 days later, after this exchange in Caesarea Philippi. 6 days later, Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up to a mountain to pray, and he's transfigured, revealing his divinity to his inner circle of disciples. Then, after the transfiguration, they come down off the mountain. Again, we don't know exactly where. Probably in the region of the Galilee. But then Jesus cures this young boy possessed by a demon. And then Matthew tells us for sure right after that, we are back in Galilee, and Jesus predicts his death and resurrection for a second time. It's the second time Jesus tells the disciples that he's going to die and be raised from the dead. And then we get to chapter 18 with its themes of humility, forgiveness, and the nature of the Christian community. So Matthew opens chapter 18 with a little exchange. The disciples ask Jesus, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus gets a little child. He brings the little child over and he tells the disciples that you have to be like a child to be great in the kingdom of heaven. It's an exercise in humility. It turns our perceptions of who's great in the world on their heads. It's not about power and authority. It's not about wealth and affluence. It's about the innocence and the humility of a child. Then Matthew goes on, and he tells us the parable of the lost sheep. Briefly, the parable of the lost sheep is where a shepherd has 100 sheep and one of them strays from the rest. And the shepherd leaves the 99 to find the one lost sheep. Underscore God's desire for each and every one of us to be part of the larger community. Underscore the themes of forgiveness and reconciliation that run throughout this chapter. After that short parable, we get into our passage for today. We get into, if another member of the church sins against you, it's about conflict resolution. It's about how to be a community of believers and do the things that Jesus wants us to do. Jesus wants us to be in community. God wants us to be a part of something larger than ourselves. And this passage is the playbook for how to make sure that that happens. Conflict has been around since the beginning of time, right? It's only a matter of time before we experience conflict in our own communities. And Jesus tells us how to do it. So the first thing that Jesus says is when another member sins against you. Now, we talked about this a little bit in adult formation this morning, and I think we hit the nail on the head here. Sin. When another member sins against you. In our modern context, we tend to bring a lot of baggage with that word. Sin tends to be ugly. Sin tends to be nasty. Sin is intentional most of the time. But if you look at the Greek word, hamartano simply means to fall short. It simply means to miss the mark, to err, to be mistaken. So when another member of the church, when another member of our community makes a mistake or errs, we are to confront that person. A lot of times, I think, maybe the person doesn't even realize what they've done. Maybe they hurt somebody's feelings unintentionally and didn't even know that they had sinned against another member. And this is where Jesus says, when that happens, go to that person, face to face. And if that member listens to you, you have regained that bond. You have restored that relationship. That person that was outside the community because of the thing that had happened is now brought back into the community. Jesus recognizes sometimes that won't work. Sometimes it's not that easy. Sometimes you might have to get somebody to go with you. And when these conflicts happen, how many times have we fallen into some of these unhealthy ways of dealing with that conflict? And it's very rare that it's just the two people that have had conflict or aware of the conflict. Most of the time, there's other people that know about it. So when that happens, these other people start to engage in some of these unhealthy ways of dealing with conflict. How about, hey, have you talked to that person? Can I go with you to talk to that person if you don't want to do it by yourself? That's exactly what Jesus is talking about. Jesus is talking about having somebody there to support, maybe even to mediate the conversation. Just to engage in conversation goes a long way in resolving these issues. But Jesus also recognizes that sometimes even that's not possible. Sometimes you're going to have to escalate it to the next level. Take it to the church, Jesus says. Now let me be clear, and we talked about this morning in adult formation. I don't think that means that we stand on the chancel steps and say, I've got a problem with so-and-so. I don't think that's what Jesus is talking about. Marty brought up a great point. I think she's absolutely right. One of the ways that we take that conflict to the church is we take it to the community in prayer. We're usually aware of these conflicts. Take it to God in prayer. Let God help us discern how to deal with these conflicts. And if that works, then the community is that much stronger. One of the challenging parts of this passage is, if that doesn't work, Jesus says to treat this person as a Gentile or tax collector. What that does not mean is to ostracize this person like a Gentile or tax collector. If you'll remember, to this point in Matthew's gospel, Jesus has repeatedly reached out to Gentiles. He's repeatedly included tax collectors in his circle of friends. Jesus recognizes that these people are outside of the community, and he extends a hand in humility and love to incorporate them into the larger community. Jesus isn't saying to permanently tell them, no, don't come back. Jesus is telling them to recognize that they are outside the community at this point, and do everything that we can to try to reconcile them back to the community, just like that lost sheep. Sisters and brothers, Jesus gives us a playbook this morning for how to deal with one of the most complex issues that we deal with as people: how to deal with conflict. My prayer for each and every one of us is that when we experience these conflicts, because we will, when we are slighted by somebody, when somebody has made a mistake and fallen short of our expectations, that we follow Jesus' guidance, that we act as Jesus wants us to act, and try to reconcile each other and reconcile ourselves to the larger Christian community. In the name of the Father, Son,